Okay, I'm actually redoing this, not that you'll know that, because this will be the first time any of these have been live, but I'm redoing this in light of a video I recently saw by a university professor in Liverpool, who is clearly an expert in the field of EU law. That's what he teaches, it's what he advises on. He knows his stuff far better than I ever will, or many people ever will. The video, I'll try and remember to put a link to it in here. His video is 20-something minutes long. He doesn't tell any jokes. He doesn't do any funny walks or sing or dance. It's very dry, but it's very factual. It's concise. It is evidence-based. So while it may not be entertaining, it might not be the sort of biggest thrill or biggest laugh you're going to get out of YouTube, it's possibly even more tedious than these videos, it is fact. And when you're voting, I think it's important that you are basing your vote on fact. Not just who can wear the funniest hat or put on the silliest voice, but actually facts. So I recommend you go and watch the video that hopefully will be linked in here somewhere. So, with that in mind, because it's pertinent to this point, which is really the first argument in this why are we voting to leave thing, and the first point is you are not voting to leave the EEA or WTO, meaning all of the UK's trade and benefit agreements will remain unchanged should we leave, until such a time that the UK decides to renegotiate them for any reason. Now, my initial response to this was, this is technically untrue from everything I understand. Not in terms of the WTO, this is one of these sort of red herrings, one of these conflate one thing with another thing and then say, hey, because of that thing everything will be like this or it will be like that. We need to put the WTO to one side. The WTO is sort of the base minimum standard for trade. It's like the Tesco value of trade. You know what you're getting. It's not the best, it's not the tastiest, but it does meet a base standard. Doesn't mean that that's what we need to aspire to, is the lowest level that's acceptable, which isn't anything against the WTO, but it does, and they're just as a basic level that then countries are free to build upon and work from rather than toward. So, with that in mind, it's this EEA thing, the European Economic Area. To be a member of the EEA, which is where this whole free trade thing comes from, and we benefit from the free trade agreement, the single market, to be a member of the EEA, you need to be either in the EU or the EFTA, European Free Trade, I'm going to say Association. But either way, I always get the A confused on that one. But either way, it's EU or EFTA. Now, we aren't in EFTA. EFTA is made up of Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein and Iceland. Not countries known for their sort of major populations, shall we say. Good countries, economically productive countries, countries with strong social values. You know, they are good countries. But the largest of them has a population of something like 8 million compared to our 60-something million. To give you an idea of scale and how EFTA is probably not a bad thing. I'm not entirely against EFTA. If we are silly enough to leave the EU, then EFTA's probably as good a sort of contingency plan as we will ever find, if we're allowed to join. However, when we look at the industries and the regulations wrapped around EFTA, I don't see how we would be better off there than in the EU. But that's a separate argument. The thing is, to be in the EEA, well, which we are in it because we are in the EU. If we leave the EU, we leave the EEA. There's no two ways about it. And what we can do is leave the EU and negotiate to join the EEA. However, although it has been suggested and proposed in the past that micro-nations, micro-states, which, for example, Monte Carlo is one, basically a city that's its own country. So tiny, tiny places. It has been proposed that they would be allowed to join the EEA under special conditions. We're not a tiny, tiny country, and no tiny, tiny countries have been allowed this so far, or at least it's not happened for any of them so far. So, if we left the EU, we are out of the EEA. I'm repeating this because that is how it is. If we leave the EU and negotiate to join EFTA, we are in the EEA. If we leave the EU and somehow negotiate to bypass all known sort of mechanisms and end up in the EEA, then we're in. But as it stands, leaving the EU is leaving the EEA, which means that this opening point that all of the UK's trade and benefit agreements will remain unchanged is not true. I'm not sure where else to go on this. The guy who I've hopefully linked to in this video really does explain it much better. The UK's trade and benefit agreements, just in general, and I think there's another video coming up on that, are based on us being in the EU. So the EEA is based on being in the EU. Our various agreements with many countries are based on us being in the EU. All of that stops if we leave the EU. So point number one in this many-pointed thing that I'm responding to is factually inaccurate, shall we diplomatically say.